Black CEO told, "This table is reserved for real clients," by white billionaire 9 minutes. Later, she buys the restaurant. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. The restaurant was buzzing with quiet chatter, the faint clink of glasses, and the soft hum of background music. At a table near the window, a woman entered with an air of calm authority, wearing a simple black sweater and tailored jeans. No flashy accessories, no entourage. She walked in like any other diner except she wasn't. What no one knew was that this woman was the CEO of one of the largest companies in the country. As she approached the hostess stand, a white billionaire, who owned the restaurant, looked up from his drink, scowled, and casually said, "This table is reserved for real clients." The words cut through the air, and for a moment, the entire room went silent. But this wasn't just any woman being humiliated. She wasn't there to beg for a seat. She was there to make a point, and in just 9 minutes, everything would change. Asterisk asterisk. Stay tuned to find out what happens next. Asterisk asterisk. You won't believe what she does next. Asterisk asterisk. She simply nodded, her calm demeanor betraying no sign of the storm brewing inside. She wasn't just a customer here. She owned the world. The moment those words left his lips, a fire ignited. She wasn't some random diner who could be pushed aside. She was the woman who built empires, and this was about to be her empire's new battleground. She stood still for a moment, processing the insult, but the smirk on the billionaire's face was enough to set the wheels in motion. Slowly, she pulled out her phone and dialed her assistant. "Activate Protocol 6. It's time to take control." As the billionaire continued his casual mockery, little did he know, the system that supported his wealth and privilege was about to crumble, all because of one woman's quiet strength. The room was beginning to hum with whispers, people sensing something was off. As the billionaire continued to gloat, oblivious to the storm he had triggered, she made one call. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The tension was palpable. In just minutes, the billionaire would realize that the woman he'd just insulted was the one holding all the cards. Her assistant's voice came through on the phone, calm and collected. "It's all set, ma'am. You're ready." The woman looked up at the billionaire with unwavering confidence and said, "You just told the wrong person that they don't belong here. I'm buying this restaurant." The billionaire's grin faltered, and the room went still. The guests around them were watching, some recording, others too stunned to speak. She didn't raise her voice, but her words had the weight of 100 battles won. As she stared him down, she could feel the power shift in the room. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. It was about proving a point, about showing the world that no matter who you were, you could take back what was yours. The billionaire's hands shook slightly, his control slipping with each passing second. "You can't be serious," he stammered. "Watch me," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. At that moment, his empire, built on discrimination and elitism, began to crack. A minute later, she wasn't just a diner at the table. She was the owner of it all. The billionaire's world was about to come crashing down, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had made the worst mistake of his life. The billionaire stood frozen, his face turning pale as he processed her words. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The guests around them had gone quiet, watching the exchange with wide eyes, some still recording, others too stunned to speak. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to escalate the situation. All she needed was a calm, steady voice, and the sheer power of her presence. The billionaire's confidence faltered as the reality of what was happening hit him. His smug expression disappeared, replaced by one of disbelief. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. As the seconds passed, the tension in the air grew thick, but she remained still, not backing down. She wasn't here to beg for a seat. She wasn't here to play by the rules that others set for her. She was here to rewrite the rules, and she knew it. The sound of her phone vibrating in her hand broke the silence. It was her assistant. "It's all set, ma'am," the voice on the other end said. cool and professional. Proceed when ready. She took a breath, glanced around at the people still watching, and then slowly turned her gaze back to the billionaire. Without a hint of emotion, she spoke again, this time louder for the entire room to hear. You've made the wrong call. This restaurant is now mine. The words hung in the air, and it was as if time stopped for a moment. The room was still. No one dared to make a sound. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. It was about power, about dignity, about standing up against the invisible forces that sought to keep people like her in their place. The billionaire's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His empire, built on privilege and discrimination, was now crumbling before him. He had no idea how to react. She didn't care. She had taken the first step in dismantling everything he stood for. I'm not leaving here without what I deserve, she continued, her voice unwavering. And what I deserve is respect. What I deserve is this restaurant. You've just learned the hard way that I'm not someone you get to dismiss. She turned to her assistant and gave a simple nod. Initiate the purchase. The assistant's voice was instantly replaced by a calm confirmation. Understood, ma'am. Purchase in progress. The billionaire's eyes were wide with panic now, but it was too late. The transaction was happening. The paperwork was being processed. Within minutes, everything he owned, his restaurant, his wealth, was slipping through his fingers. His staff, once loyal to him, began to murmur among themselves, uncertainty in their voices. They had witnessed the shift in power. This woman was no longer just a guest in his restaurant. She was his boss, and they all knew it. The guests around them began to clap softly, at first, unsure of what they were witnessing, but slowly gaining confidence as the realization set in. She wasn't just taking control of the restaurant, she was taking control of the narrative. No longer would people like her be treated as less than. No longer would they be looked down upon. As the paperwork was finalized, the billionaire stumbled back, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. The restaurant he had once owned was now a part of her empire, and he had no one but himself to blame. She turned to the crowd, addressing them for the first time since the confrontation began. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice carrying through the room. It's about all of us. It's about the systems that keep people like me out, the systems that tell us we don't belong. Well, today, we proved them wrong. The applause grew louder, and the billionaire finally turned, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had no choice but to leave. His restaurant was no longer his, and the world had changed in the span of a few minutes. The CEO, on the other hand, stood tall, calm, and composed, knowing that she had just made a point that would echo through the restaurant industry. It wasn't just about buying a restaurant. It was about owning the power to change everything. The billionaire, still reeling from the shock of losing everything in the blink of an eye, stood frozen as the new owner of the restaurant made her way to the front, calmly addressing the now quiet crowd. The guests who had been silently watching the drama unfold were now on the edge of their seats, some in disbelief, others in awe of what had just transpired. The staff stood off to the side, uncertain, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. They had just witnessed the end of one empire and the rise of another, all in a matter of minutes. The billionaire's empire, built on a foundation of elitism and racial bias, was no more. His face flushed with anger and humiliation. He glanced at his staff, hoping for a sign of support, but none came. They had seen the power shift. They had seen who truly held the reins now. With a deep sigh, he finally turned and walked away, defeated, his shoulders slumped in resignation. The CEO watched him go, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady. She had known this moment would come. It was only a matter of time before the world saw the truth. This was not just about owning a restaurant. It was about making a statement. She had done more than just buy a piece of property. She had claimed her rightful place in a world that had tried to push her down. As she turned back to face the room, she could feel the shift in energy. The tension had broken. The atmosphere had gone from one of discomfort and discrimination to one of empowerment and unity. The guests, once hesitant to speak up, were now applauding her quiet strength, their claps growing louder and more enthusiastic. She nodded, acknowledging their support, but her mind was already focused on what came next. This was only the beginning. There were more battles to fight, more systems to tear down. She was no longer just a businesswoman. She was a force to be reckoned with. She looked at the staff one last time, her voice calm but firm as she addressed them. "I expect things to change here," she said. "There will be new policies, new training, and most importantly, a new culture. This restaurant will be a place where everyone is treated with respect, regardless of their background. There will be no more discrimination, no more exclusion. I'm taking control of this space, and I expect every single one of you to stand with me." The staff exchanged looks, the weight of her words sinking in. They knew she meant it. The room was no longer just a restaurant. It was a symbol of something greater. A place where the old ways of thinking were being replaced by something new, something inclusive. As she stood there, a quiet confidence radiating from her, she knew that this moment would resonate far beyond the walls of this restaurant. The world was watching, and she was ready to lead the change. The staff stood in stunned silence, processing her words, but deep down they all knew she wasn't bluffing. There was no way the woman who had just taken control of their restaurant was going to back down now. The billionaire was gone, but his influence still hung heavy in the air, and it was clear that this was a turning point for the entire establishment. The CEO could see it in their eyes. They were uncertain, perhaps even afraid of what would come next, but she would not let fear stand in her way. She had fought too long, climbed too high, to let this moment slip away. With a steady breath, she turned to the manager, who had been silently observing the chaos unfold. "You," she said, her voice firm yet composed, "I want a full report on every aspect of this restaurant's operation. Every employee, every policy. No more secrets. We start fresh today." The manager nodded, understanding the gravity of her words, and quickly started scribbling down notes. Her gaze swept over the remaining staff, all of whom stood frozen, unsure of what their roles would be in the new regime. She met each of their eyes with an unflinching stare, showing them that her authority was not to be questioned. "This is your last chance," she continued. "If you want to stay here, you will respect every person who walks through this door. No more prejudice, no more exclusions. We will treat everyone equally." As she spoke, her words took root. She wasn't just issuing orders, she was setting a standard. The room, once tense and divided, seemed to breathe in unison with her resolve. The walls, which had witnessed so much discrimination and segregation, seemed to echo with the promise of something new, something better. Outside the restaurant, the night had settled in, but the energy inside felt electric. The CEO glanced at the door, where the billionaire had exited moments ago. His pride shattered. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, had sealed his own fate. He had never believed that someone like her could have the power to change things so quickly, but now, it was clear that he had been wrong. Her success was not just in owning a business. It was in owning the space she had created, the culture she had nurtured. She was taking control of more than just a restaurant. She was taking control of the future. As she looked back at the staff, she gave a subtle nod, signaling that they could begin. "We're going to do things differently now, and I'll make sure you're all a part of it," she said, as the first signs of real change began to unfold. The next few days at the restaurant were filled with tense anticipation as the CEO began implementing the changes she had promised. Her presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. The staff, once reluctant, now followed her every command, knowing that she was not just an ordinary business owner. She had shown them a power they couldn't ignore, a strength they hadn't expected from someone who had been treated as an outsider for so long. Each day, she visited the restaurant, checking on the staff, meeting with the manager, ensuring that every word she spoke was being acted upon. The place that had once felt like a kingdom for the wealthy now felt different, more inclusive, more human. She had started meetings with every team member, listening to their stories, their grievances, and their hopes. She didn't just want to run a business, she wanted to create a community, one where no one would be discriminated against for any reason. There were some who resisted those who had been comfortable in the old system, the ones who had benefited from the racial and social divides, but even they couldn't deny the change in the air. No one could stand in the way of a movement that was bigger than any one person. The walls of the restaurant seemed to hold the weight of this transformation, and it wasn't long before word of the new management spread beyond the restaurant. Customers, who had once been hesitant to come, now flocked to the restaurant, eager to support the new vision. The menu changed. The decor shifted. But more than that, the energy in the space felt different. It felt like home for the first time. The CEO didn't stop there. She started reaching out to other businesses in the area, inviting them to join her in creating a more inclusive environment. She knew this was just the beginning, and she wasn't about to let it end with one restaurant. She was laying the groundwork for something much bigger, something that would change the entire industry. As she sat in her office one afternoon, looking out over the restaurant floor, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had done it. The transformation had begun. She had taken what was once a symbol of exclusion and turned it into a beacon of change. And this was only the start. As the weeks passed, the changes at the restaurant began to take root, but the CEO knew this was only the beginning of a much larger revolution. The guests who had once been skeptical were now returning in droves, drawn not just by the food, but by the energy that filled the air. They could feel the difference. They could see it in the way the staff greeted them, in the way the environment had shifted from exclusive to inclusive. The culture she had promised was taking shape. The CEO knew that for true change to occur, the work couldn't stop at just one business. It had to spread, ripple outward like a stone thrown into a pond. She began reaching out to other local business owners, particularly those in the hospitality industry, to share her vision. She spoke about creating spaces where every individual, no matter their background, could feel welcome, where the old systems of exclusion and privilege could no longer thrive. Some were skeptical. Some were defensive, unwilling to acknowledge the deep-rooted biases that had shaped their businesses for decades. But she didn't back down. She understood that real change would come through persistence, and that it would take time for some to let go of their old ways of thinking. But she also knew that with each conversation, each new partnership, the ripple effect would grow stronger. As she sat in her office one afternoon, reviewing the plans for expansion, she received a call from one of her most trusted advisors. "We've had some unexpected developments," her advisor said, sounding a bit tense. "There's talk. Some of the larger chains are starting to notice the impact you're making, and they're not happy about it." The CEO listened intently, her expression unchanged. She knew that she would face resistance, but it didn't faze her. "Let them talk," she replied, her voice calm but with an edge of determination. "The bigger they are, the harder they fall. We're creating something that can't be ignored, and no amount of backlash will stop us now." As she hung up the phone, she stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. It was quiet now, but she could feel the undercurrent of change building, like a storm on the horizon. She wasn't just building a brand, she was creating a movement. And the world was beginning to take notice. The next few weeks brought unexpected challenges. As word of the restaurant's transformation spread, the pressure began to mount. The larger chains, the ones that had been operating under the old rules for years, were now watching closely, and they didn't like what they saw. The CEO's vision, her insistence on changing the status quo, was beginning to shake the very foundations of the industry. But she remained unshaken. She knew this wouldn't be easy, and she was prepared for the fight. One afternoon, a group of executives from a major restaurant conglomerate asked to meet with her. They were all white, sharp-dressed, and clearly out of their element in her establishment. They'd come with one message: "We don't think what you're doing is sustainable. You're creating a niche, and we don't see how it could be profitable in the long run." The CEO listened patiently, her face calm, but her mind was racing. These men, sitting across from her, had no idea what they were dealing with. They thought her focus on diversity and inclusion was just a trend, something that could be brushed aside once the novelty wore off. They were wrong. "What I'm doing isn't about creating a niche," she replied evenly, her voice measured, but with an unmistakable edge. "It's about creating a new standard. A standard where every person, regardless of their race or background, is treated equally. It's about creating spaces that reflect the world we live in, not the one you've been comfortable with." The room fell silent. The executives exchanged glances, but no one spoke. She knew they didn't fully understand yet, but that didn't matter. "If you're here to tell me that inclusion isn't profitable, then you've already lost. This is the future," she continued, her eyes locking onto theirs. And the future doesn't look like what you've built. The tension in the room was palpable, but she wasn't finished. The world is changing, gentlemen. Your customers want something different. They want a place where they don't have to wonder if they belong. And I'm not just talking about my restaurant. This is a movement. It's bigger than me, and it's bigger than any of you. You can either adapt or be left behind. The executives were speechless, clearly caught off guard by her confidence. The CEO stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Good luck," she said, offering them a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But I suggest you start paying attention, because the world isn't waiting for you." As they left, the CEO stood by the window, watching them retreat into the elevator. She knew this fight was far from over. There would be more resistance, more obstacles ahead, but she wasn't backing down. This was just the beginning. Her movement was gaining momentum, and the world was starting to realize that it was time for a change. The days that followed were filled with quiet determination as the CEO continued to execute her vision for change. The tension with the larger industry was palpable, but she refused to be intimidated. As more and more businesses reached out, either out of curiosity or with offers to collaborate, she remained firm in her stance. She was creating something different, something that couldn't be ignored. Word of her actions spread, and soon, more people began speaking out about the need for transformation within the restaurant industry. She was no longer just a business owner. She had become a symbol of defiance against the old guard, a beacon of hope for those who had long been marginalized. Despite the growing support, the challenges continued to mount. There were still whispers among her competitors, some calling her methods too radical, too bold. Others tried to discredit her, claiming that her focus on inclusivity was just a marketing tactic. But the CEO wasn't swayed. She was focused on the bigger picture. One evening, as she sat in her office, reviewing plans for the next phase of her expansion, her assistant entered with an update. "There's been a development," her assistant said, her voice cautious. "Some of the bigger players in the industry are starting to take notice, and they're not happy. They're calling it the diversity trend, and they think it'll fade out eventually." The CEO leaned back in her chair, considering the information. "Let them think that," she said, her voice calm but filled with quiet resolve. "The ones who think this is a trend don't understand the depth of the problem. What we're building is a movement, not a trend." She turned her attention back to the files in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on what lay ahead. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. The industry would resist, but the momentum was on her side. The world was changing, and the people who thought they controlled the narrative were starting to realize that they no longer did. She had started something that couldn't be undone. The next day, a major food critic from a well-known publication visited her restaurant. He had been skeptical at first, dismissing the concept as a flash in the pan, but now, he was curious. She greeted him with the same grace and confidence she had greeted every other customer, but her eyes were sharp. She knew what he was thinking. He didn't believe in what she was doing, but she was about to change his mind. As they sat together at a table, discussing the restaurant's recent success, the critic's initial skepticism began to fade. The atmosphere in the restaurant was undeniable: the inclusivity, the diversity, the energy. It was unlike anything he had experienced before. By the end of the evening, he had written a glowing review. She had won him over, not with words, but with action. As she read the review later that night, she smiled to herself. The tide was turning. The critics who once doubted her now had no choice but to recognize the power of her vision. The future was unfolding, and she was leading the way. The restaurant had become more than just a place to eat. It had transformed into a symbol of what was possible when power was reclaimed and systems of exclusion were dismantled. The CEO's vision had not only revolutionized the restaurant's operations but had begun to influence the entire industry. The once skeptical critics and business leaders who had dismissed her were now scrambling to understand how she had succeeded where so many had failed. Her name had become synonymous with change, and it was clear that the old guard was losing its grip. Despite the growing recognition, the CEO knew that the fight wasn't over. The battle for true equality was ongoing, and there were still those who would resist. As her restaurant expanded into new locations, she received another wave of resistance from her competitors. They didn't want to admit it, but the success of her business model was undeniable. There were whispers about how she had played the game differently, how she had dared to challenge the established norms. Yet, what they failed to understand was that her success wasn't about playing the game, it was about changing the rules altogether. One evening, while sitting in the new flagship location, the CEO received a call from one of her trusted advisors. "There's been some noise from corporate headquarters," the advisor said, sounding slightly anxious. "They're concerned. The chains are talking about how your restaurants are setting new standards, and they feel it's going to force them to change." The CEO paused, listening closely. "And what do they suggest?" she asked calmly. "They want to know if you're willing to ease up on some of the changes, perhaps compromise on the inclusivity initiatives. They're worried about the impact on profits," her advisor replied. The CEO smiled to herself. This was the moment she had been preparing for. She wasn't about to back down now, not when the momentum had shifted so dramatically. "Tell them no," she said, her voice firm. "We're not compromising. Not now, not ever. This is the new standard. If they can't keep up, that's their problem, not mine." She hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the busy restaurant floor. The air in the space was filled with a different energy, now one of excitement and possibility. She had created a model of business that prioritized people over profits, and the results spoke for themselves. The success of her vision was no longer a question, it was a reality. As she looked around at the vibrant, diverse group of customers enjoying their meals, she felt a deep sense of pride. This was her legacy in the making. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but she was ready. She had already changed the industry once, and she would do it again. The world had changed because she had dared to challenge it, and now, nothing would stop her. The following weeks brought more recognition than she had ever imagined, but the CEO knew that the real work had only just begun. The industry's resistance, though still present, was no match for the momentum she had built. With every new location she opened, and every new partnership she forged, the impact of her vision rippled further, slowly but surely disrupting the entrenched norms of the restaurant world. Her phone rang incessantly with offers to collaborate, to speak at conferences, and to lead panels. She was invited to share her success story, to offer advice, but she had no interest in just being a symbol of what could be. She wanted to lead more than just conversations, she wanted to lead real change. One afternoon, she sat with a group of investors in a sleek downtown conference room, their eyes glued to her as she discussed the future of her expanding business. "I'm not just looking to build a brand," she said, her voice calm and unwavering. "I'm looking to create a movement. This goes beyond the restaurant. This is about changing how business is done, how we treat each other, how we see power and privilege." The investors exchanged glances, some clearly impressed by her vision, others unsure of what it meant for their bottom line. "What we've done here is just the beginning," she continued, glancing around the room. "I'm not interested in maintaining the status quo. I want to see systems change from the ground up. And I want to help others build businesses that are not only successful but also inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. If we want to see the future we've been talking about, we have to make it happen ourselves." She could see the gears turning in the room, the realization settling in that this wasn't just a business pitch. It was a challenge, one that would force them to rethink everything they had ever known about business, power, and profit. Later that evening, as she walked through the busy restaurant, the energy was palpable. The once skeptical employees were now some of her strongest allies, fully on board with the changes she had made, and proud of the work they were doing together. Her vision had not just transformed the business, it had transformed them as well. The CEO couldn't help but smile to herself. She had done what others said was impossible, and the change she had started wasn't just going to survive, it was going to thrive. As she looked around at the diverse group of customers, laughing and enjoying their meals, she knew one thing for sure. The world had changed because of the choices she had made, and it was only going to keep getting better. As the months passed, the CEO's influence continued to grow, not just within the restaurant industry, but across the broader business world. Her brand was no longer just about food. It had become a beacon for equity, inclusion, and change. Investors, who had once been hesitant, were now eager to be a part of her vision, recognizing that she was leading a transformation that was both necessary and inevitable. With each new project she took on, She made sure that her values equality, respect, and fairness were embedded in every aspect of the operation. She didn't just want to create another successful business. She wanted to reshape the way people thought about business. It wasn't about profit at any cost. It was about balancing success with social responsibility. As she sat in her office one afternoon, looking out over the city, she received a call that would change everything. It was from a major national media outlet, one that had been following her journey since the beginning. They wanted to feature her story on their cover. The opportunity was huge, and she knew it would bring even more attention to her cause. However, she wasn't interested in just being famous. She was focused on the work that still needed to be done. After a brief pause, she accepted the offer, knowing that it would give her the platform to amplify her message even further. The story was published a week later, and it went viral. The cover shot showed her in her signature black outfit, standing tall, with a look of determination in her eyes. The headline read, "Revolutionizing Business: How One CEO is Changing the Game." The media attention that followed was intense, but instead of basking in the spotlight, she used the moment to bring even more attention to the issues that mattered most. She spoke about the importance of diversity, the need for fair pay, and the value of creating spaces where everyone was welcome. As the spotlight grew brighter, so did her resolve. Her story wasn't just about her success, it was about the thousands of people who had supported her and believed in her vision. It was about those who had been silenced, overlooked, and dismissed for far too long. And now, she was using her position to speak for them. With every interview, every speech, she made sure to highlight the need for systemic change, and more people were starting to listen. Her movement had gained momentum, and it wasn't slowing down. She had built more than just a successful restaurant empire. She had created a movement that was changing the world. And this was just the beginning. She wasn't done yet. There was still so much more work to do. As the media storm settled, the CEO found herself standing at a crossroads, with the weight of her success now matched by the responsibility it carried. Her movement had taken on a life of its own, growing into something far larger than the restaurants and businesses she had started. People were watching, and they weren't just watching her, they were watching for change. Every step she took, every decision she made, would have repercussions far beyond her immediate circle. She knew that her influence could be a force for even greater good, but it also meant that the stakes had never been higher. One morning, she sat in her office, looking over the data from her latest projects, reflecting on how far she had come. The challenges had been immense, and there were times when the pressure seemed unbearable, but she had never once considered giving up. Her drive, her determination, had been forged through years of overcoming obstacles, from the subtle prejudices to the overt discrimination that had followed her throughout her career. Now, with the empire she had built, she was in a position to ensure that the systems of inequality she had once battled were dismantled for good. Her vision wasn't just about creating opportunities for herself. It was about changing the fabric of the industry, and it was happening. The restaurant groups she had been working with had begun to implement her diversity and inclusion model. More and more businesses were reaching out to adopt similar policies, inspired by the undeniable success of her business model. In a private meeting with her top executives, she outlined her next phase: to expand beyond the restaurant industry and into other fields, particularly tech and retail. "This isn't just about food," she told them, her voice filled with quiet power. "This is about creating a new normal in business, a normal where everyone has an equal chance, where no one is held back because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. We're going to set the example for other industries to follow. It's time to create a world where discrimination isn't just unacceptable, it's impossible." The team sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of her words. She had a vision that was becoming reality, and they knew that working alongside her was not just a career, it was a movement. Weeks later, as she walked into a new office space, now one of several for her growing empire, she paused to take it all in. The walls, once symbolic of exclusion, now echoed with the sound of diverse voices working together, creating something special. This was no longer just about her, it was about a new era, and she had been the one to start it. The work was far from over, but she had made it clear to the world that the rules had changed. As she stepped into the future, She knew that her legacy wouldn't just be about buildings or companies, it would be about a transformation that would last for generations to come.